We now continue our discussion of critical methodologies with form criticism, a method that tried to trace the pre-literary oral stages of biblical sources. Form criticism was invented by a German scholar named Hermann Gunkel. Form criticism, as he understood it, was a means of analyzing the typical features of texts, especially their conventional forms or structures, in order to relate them to their sociological contexts. The methodology consists of the following. 1. Analyze the structure of a document. Structure could be its outline or its pattern or its schema. And the structure is analyzed by, first of all, establishing pericopes. Pericope is a technical term for a unit which can be read independently of the larger literary work in which the pericope is incorporated. Kind of like a stanza in a poem or a episode in a longer narrative, that kind of thing. Form critics usually assume the pericopes were once independent oral units. They also look for introductory and concluding formulas, and they pay special attention to where the text changes genres. For example, if you change from prose to poetry, but then change back from poetry to prose, well, that is important to the form critics who emphasize genre in their analysis. Secondly, they consider genre pericopes within the larger unit. Now, the word for genre is Gattung in German, and that's the word Gunkel would use. And he would notice where prose began and poetry began at different places. And where you have prose, he would ask, well, what kind of prose is it in terms of genre? Or poetry, what kind of poetry is it? So prose, it could be historical narrative, or it could be simple storytelling, legend, sagas. Poetry, well, if you take different types of psalms, they could be hymns, they could be laments. And one of the things he'd like to do is to compare these genres with similar examples found either in the Bible or elsewhere in the ancient biblical world. For example, if you were looking at the covenant within the Pentateuch, you might want to compare that with, say, Hittite treaties, which has a similar kind of structure. And this method then assumes that some genres are stereotyped. Just as when you write a business letter in English, there are certain ways that you tend to write such things. Third step in the methodology of form criticism is to define the settings for each genre unit. Now, the German term for this genre setting is Sitz im Leben, which means situation in life or setting in life. And this setting is not historical circumstance, but rather the place in Israel's sociological life where this type of material would be expected to be utilized. So, for example, if you had a law, if one man's ox gores another man's ox to death, the carcass is to be divided and the live ox is to be sold and the proceeds divided. Well, that would be a law, and you'd expect to find laws of that sort in a courtroom type setting. Hymns that praise God are usually used in public worship settings. Proverbial sayings, as in the book of Proverbs, would tend to be used in family settings, fatherly advice to children. Narratives might have been used in circles of storytellers and the like. Related to the setting is the question, well, who is the speaker? And who is the audience in such settings? A fourth step in the methodology is to establish the intention, purpose, or function of the genre units in a text. Was the intention of the genre in the original? What was the intention of the genre in the original typical setting? And what was the function of this genre within the larger literary unit? So you have a hymn. Well, hymns would normally be in the genre setting, in a worship setting, but a hymn in the mouth of a character could be used in the larger literary unit to show the character's piety. One place where we could see an example of this is in Psalm 2. What's the structure of Psalm 2? And, well, if you were to look at Psalm 2, and I have the text here, you have 4 stanzas, each of 3 verses. And in each stanza, there's going to be a reference to both God and the human king. Kings of the earth stand up against the Lord and his anointed one. That's God and the king. And God laughs at them and says he's established his king, the human king, on Zion. And same thing with each of the other stanzas. Each refers to both God and the human king. And there's also a change of narration along the way. It looks like, for example, that it begins with a narrator, but then in verse 6, God speaks. God says, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. In verses 7 through 9, the king speaks. I will proclaim the decree of the Lord. He has said to me, that's the king speaking, you are my son, and today I have become your father. And ask of me, and I will make the nations as your inheritance, and so forth. And then there's the narrator, or the king, seems to speak at the last several verses. Of some debate as to who speaks there. So the Sitzenleben seems to be a coronation of the king, and in this regard, you can imagine where the priest would serve as narrator and speak for God, and the king will speak in the middle, as he says, I'll tell you the decree of the Lord. He has said to me, you are my son. This day, the day of coronation, I have begotten you. Now, it's hard to find a plausible Sitzenleben if, as many Christians have understood Psalm 2, if the psalm is a pure prediction of Messiah. Because when would you actually sing these particular words in the way that they're formulated in the sociological setting of ancient Israel? Rather, the Sitzenleben seems to be the coronation of the king, but it is indirectly predictive of Messiah. It does tell you what, the intent or the function of this psalm is to celebrate the divine election of the Davidic office at the enthronement of each king. It celebrates the promise made to David in 2 Samuel 7, along with the covenant made with David, and God's plan for the Davidic office and kingdom that ultimately involves the Davidic king having sovereignty over the entire world, a promise that is only completely fulfilled in Jesus Christ. So it is indirectly predictive of Messiah, but it was applied to each king as they were coronated onto the throne. Now go to the next video where we will complete our analysis of form criticism and begin the analysis of certain other methodologies.